The Tuesday edition of Locked On Grizzlies, and we are talking Tuomas Iisalo, the new head coach in Memphis. How did his summer league go? We're going to review that to start off the show. Plus, a way too early takeaway on who the starter should be for the Memphis Grizzlies and key reserves. All that and more on this episode of Locked On Grizzlies. Let's lock in.
You are Locked On Grizzlies, your daily Memphis Grizzlies podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey there, everybody. Welcome to this installment of Locked On Grizzlies. It is I, Joe Mullinax, once more your host. Once more, no DeMichael Cole. I know I'm disappointed too. Again, the guy's busy. He's got things going on. DeMichael is well. I can assure you he'll be back with us later this week on the podcast. And again, as I told you yesterday, if you missed yesterday's show, first off, make sure you go check it out. I thought it was a good one. But if you missed yesterday's show, we're going to do our best to grind through the rest of July being your team every day. And then once we hit August, we'll maybe tone things back a bit as the dog days of the offseason really get in. So welcome to Tuesday's episode. I'm Joe Mullinax. I'm happy to be with you on this installment of the podcast. Make sure you're liking, commenting, rating, reviewing, subscribing wherever you get podcasts. We are free and available as proud members of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team each and every day. That means Apple, that means Spotify, Amazon, Google, YouTube, literally anywhere and everywhere you get a podcast, you can find us here on Locked On Grizzlies. And we're so glad that you have found us today. And looking forward to talking Grizzlies basketball with you for the next 30 minutes-ish. Tuomas Iisalo, we didn't talk a ton about him yesterday. Yesterday, we did a lot of summer league takeaways, focused on Javon Small, who looked really good, focused on Jalen Wells, who for some reason, some of you out there in the comment verse don't like anymore, but I'm a big fan of Jalen Wells. And by the way, hit me up on X at Joe Mullinax. Let me know in the comments, wherever you might be commenting, how you feel about the show, your takeaways. Happy to have those conversations and discussions. I don't fully understand the Jalen Wells disdain, but we'll talk more about that later on in the program. That was yesterday's show. Today, we're going to focus on Tuomas Iisalo. And on a much smaller scale, I can relate to Tuomas Iisalo. I'm a coach myself. I'm a high school football coach. So I'm not a new National Basketball Association coach. It's not a perfect comp. But in the articles I've read, both by DeMichael, of course, my wonderful co-host, Memphis Grizzlies beat writer for the Commercial Appeal, the Grizzlies beat writer for the Daily Memphian, Drew Hill, so many others that do phenomenal work covering the team. What I've read about what Iisalo was looking for from this summer league was establishing a culture of work ethic and intensity and the effort that has to come along with if you're going to be a good defensive team, right? And I do think that that is something that we need to continue to remind ourselves of. The Grizzlies' offense was not the problem last year, especially during the faltering 13 and 17, falling from the second or third seed to the play-in, the firing of Taylor Jenkins, all that transpired. That was not because of the offense. That was because the defense sputtered in a way that we hadn't seen it happen since Taylor Jenkins became the head coach back in 2019. That is why Taylor Jenkins is no longer the head coach of the Memphis Grizzlies, because the thing that he hung his hat on had fallen apart. So Tuomas Iisalo reestablishing what that effort has to look like, what that attitude has to look like. And any coach worth their salt is going to say exactly those two words a lot of times: effort and attitude. Because that is what so much of playing defense in basketball is. How much effort are you expending to stay in front of your man, to execute and pull on the string, to make your rotation, to do your assignment? And how is your attitude about playing defense? Playing defense in the NBA at times is a lot like playing offensive line in football. If you don't get the steal, if you don't get the block, if all you're doing is maintaining leverage and keeping your feet underneath you and preventing dribble penetration, somebody might point it out and post a video, and somebody might make it go viral on social media. But the reality is there's a lot of unthanked work that goes on the defensive end of the court. There's a lot of times where a big making a smart rotation to prevent a pass that might go across from one end of the court to the other, that's not going to get noticed to the naked eye, or even somebody that pays attention to basketball on a regular basis. A coach might notice it because they're paid to watch the film over and over again. That might be them that implemented that scheme, and of course they're going to be able to point it out. but the significance of making the effort to cut off that passing lane, to see the need to cut off that passing lane, to put in the time in terms of film study, to make the effort known, both on and off the court, what it's going to be a Memphis Grizzlies basketball player. It's important to instill that in your young players, and that's exactly what Summer League is, right? It's important to make sure that they understand what this is going to be, because they are the ones that are going to make up, in the case of Jalen Wells, a part of your starting lineup. They're going to be the ones, in the case of Javon Small, Jemai Mashak, they're going to be the ones that make up the back end of your rotation or the key of your developmental with the Memphis Hustle. In the case of Cam Spencer and ZG Jackson, they're going to be competing for reserve minutes. So up and down the roster, you are looking at reasons why instilling this kind of mindset matters. And that is more significant than anything else. Having that capacity to compete. You have to get that instilled from day one. And it sounds like that was a priority for Tuomas Iisalo. As far as the scheme, offensively, they're going to play quickly. I don't know if they're going to play as fast as they did last year. I don't know if it'll be as gimmicky as it was. We have to be honest and say part of the reason the offense improved, although it did improve, beyond just Jaren Jackson Jr. continuing his growth and other players having strong seasons, part of the reason that improvement happened was gimmicky, right? As teams figured out what the Grizzlies were trying to do, that's a part of the process of that 13-17 record. The offense got worse during that time. It was still better than the defense, but there were still offensive concerns. So making sure that the offense is clean and crisp, executed well. You still saw a lot of screen setting, and we'll talk more about that later on in the show. I think that initial pick and roll concept is going to be a major determinant. How are you going to get minutes on this team? If you're a big, are you able to screen and screen effectively? If you're a bigger forward, GG Jackson, are you able to screen and screen effectively? Because if you're not, you're probably not going to play very much. Spoiler alert to later on in the show when it comes to Gigi. Are you going to be strong in the dunker spot as a big? Are you going to be able to make the extra pass as a wing? Going from a good shot to a great shot off of dribble penetration. That's some of the stuff that I saw. That initial screen being so valuable. It's really kind of setting the tone for the offense as a whole. And then defensively, picking up guys at 94 feet, shorter rotations in terms of minutes being played, 4-minute stints maybe, almost like hockey. Obviously, hockey stints are shorter in their the way they do their lines and line changes. But is it possible that works in a regular season NBA game in November? Maybe. But I think that he's going to ask a lot in terms of effort defensively. So much of last year was talked about the effort that was exerted offensively, playing with pace, playing so fast. The Indiana Pacers got so much credit for how fast they played the game. The Memphis Grizzlies played faster. So that's going to be a really important cog of this moving forward. Just how fast is Memphis going to be expected to play offensively? And how is that going to connect to the defensive end? Because you could make a pretty easy correlation. Correlation is not always causation. But I think that the wearing down of the team as the season went on and the defense going by the wayside, it's more than just one factor. But how does Iisalo slow the process down when it's necessary? How do you rely on a player like Zach Edey, who, again, we'll talk more about here in a moment? But how do you rely on a 7'4", 290-pound player and talk about playing with pace? Edey does not get the credit that he should get for being the athlete and the conditioned player that he is. But the NBA is vastly different than playing in the Big Ten. He's going to not be able to implement the kind of pace that Jenkins and his assistant Adam LaRoche wanted. Or not Adam LaRoche, LaRoche. Those guys, they were really focused on speed of play. And I think that Tuomas Iisalo is going to want to do that to an extent. But how you activate your sets and your looks off of that initial big man screen and how able you are to effectively execute that initial movement is going to play a large hand in who starts and who gets minutes on this Grizzlies roster moving forward. Let me know on X, at Joe Mullinax. Hit me up in the comments. How are you feeling about Tuomas Iisalo coming out of Summer League? It's hard to say too much, obviously. It's just Summer League basketball. But it was his first chance as the actual head coach of the team. to implement a lot of his scheme and his cultural aspects to what a winning Grizzlies basketball program should look like. That was fun to watch out in Utah and then in Vegas. When we come back here on Locked On Grizzlies, we're going to talk about early thoughts on who are going to be the starters for the 2025-2026 Memphis Grizzlies on opening night. Stick around. Today's episode of Locked On Grizzlies is brought to you by Monarch Money. Have you ever wished managing your money felt easier? With Monarch Money, it can. Whether you're growing your savings or planning a big purchase, Monarch puts you in the driver's seat. It's like having your own personal CFO, giving you full visibility and control over your finances. Monarch Money is more than a budgeting app. It's a complete financial command center. You can track all of your accounts, investments, and spending in one place. So in addition to managing your money, you are also building wealth. I love the fact that my wife and I can go in one app, managing our money on a day-to-day basis, seeing what we need, how we need to utilize the wealth that we have built, and how we can put that in other places for our family. 3 kids, they're only getting older, they're only getting bigger, they're only eating more food, right? We got to make sure that we're saving and being smart financially, and Monarch Money helps us do that. Take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use the code LOCKEDONNBA at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. That's monarchmoney.com, code LOCKEDONNBA for half off your first year. So the starting lineup, and this was inspired by a question or from a comment in YouTube from yesterday's show. So thank you so much to our wonderful YouTube commenters being part of our process here. This time of year, this is a good time of year to suggest things in the comments as we enter those dog days of the off season. And I want to preface this with saying that it's way too early, right? Like, is it entirely possible that the Grizzlies can make a trade still and completely blow this up? Yeah. Is it entirely possible that an injury happens, knock on all of the pieces of wood in your general vicinity? Yeah. We know that Zach Edey and Jaren Jackson Jr. are already dealing with injuries that are going to complicate this a little bit, right? So this is as of July 22nd, 2025, who the Grizzlies starting lineup and then their rotation behind that should be, according to me, right? Maybe we talk about this from the perspective of how DeMichael Cole sees Tuomas Iisalo implementing the rotation moving forward. That's how DeMichael likes to roll, and that's a good way to roll. But I'm Coach Joe Mullinax here on Locked On Grizzlies when I'm allowed to fly solo. And I'm going to fly high, baby, as I talk about how I would execute this Grizzlies roster as presently constructed. There are now 2 non-negotiables on the starting lineup, and that's Ja Morant and Jaren Jackson Jr., right? They are your max or near max in the case of Jaren contracts. They are your dudes that if you don't have them performing at a high level, you're not winning anything anyway, right? So it's Ja and it's Jaren. I personally would argue there's a third non-negotiable, and that's Zach Edey, right? Now, again, this is when the team is healthy. On opening night, Jaren Jackson Jr. very well may not be in the starting lineup. Zach Edey almost certainly will not be in the starting lineup. Obviously, there needs to be medical updates as the summer goes on, but both of those procedures and timelines, it was reevaluation around the time of training camp. That doesn't mean they're cleared. That means they have to be reevaluated. So we're operating in a world where the Grizzlies are actually healthy, right? In reality, it's probably 2 other guys starting in the front court. But Jaren and Edey are the likely starters there. And again, I think Zach Edey is a non-negotiable for the exact reason that we were talking about earlier in the show. I've seen so much Iisalo film now, both from Summer League and from what he did with Paris basketball in his last stint as a head coach. I know how important it is for him to have an athletic point guard, Ja Morant. I know how important it is for him to have a true screen-setting big that can do a lot of different things in terms of getting to the rim and playing around the basket off of those screens. Enter Zach Edey. So I think Zach Edey is a starter. If Taylor Jenkins agreed with that sentiment, he might still be the head coach of the Memphis Grizzlies, right? So Zach Edey almost certainly going to be a starter. Not in the same realm as Ja and Jaren for obvious reasons, but I think he's the next safest bet when the whole team is healthy. Again, it's probably going to be Brandon Clark and Santi Aldama when the season actually begins because of health concerns. My 2 starters on the wings, Kentavious Caldwell-Pope and Jalen Wells. I love that pairing in the backcourt because those are 2 of the better defensive wing players in the entire National Basketball Association. And it allows for you to maximize Ja Morant. I have said this time and again, maybe this will be the t-shirt for the 2025-2026 season of Locked On Grizzlies. If Ja isn't Ja, nothing else matters. Point blank, period, full stop. If Ja Morant is not the guy that he was at the end of the season, to his credit, he looked like the Ja of old. In some ways, he looked better at times. I like to remind everybody that the Grizzlies were winning by 20-plus points at the end of the first half of Game 3 against the eventual NBA champion Oklahoma City Thunder. Doesn't mean Memphis would have won that series, but it does mean it is not nearly the blowout sweep that people like to think it was. Injuries happen, of course. If Ja doesn't get hurt, the Grizzlies win Game 3. Maybe that series looks a little bit different. I still think the Thunder win the series, but Memphis doesn't get swept. I think that you need MVP caliber, because he's not going to win it. Nikola Jokic exists. Shai Gilgeous-Alexander exists. Giannis exists. Luka Doncic probably will be more comfortable in La La Land with the Lakers. But if Ja is the 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th best player in the NBA next year, Jaren is a top 20 player in the NBA next year, then the Grizzlies are going to be a playoff team, and they're going to contend for a run in the postseason. Again, the Thunder exist. They're the favorites until they get knocked off. But a healthy Ja Morant matters. That's why you have Zach Edey in that role as that elite 7'4", 290-pound screening big that can roll to the rim and do some other things at and around the paint. And that's why you have two strong perimeter defenders allowing for Ja to defend whoever's left. All right, Ja, you pick up the third threat. I'd love for Ja Morant to be a positive influence on the defensive end. I'd love for him to not just be a steal hunter, a block hunter, a numbers hunter that can stay in front of people and physically do things. So instead of longing and wishing for what we want to be, we need to be happy with what we have. Ja Morant is an elite basketball player, one of the very best on the planet when he's at his best. And Jaren Jackson Jr. isn't far behind. So let them be themselves. Now, there's levels to this, right? I think Jaren, for example, could be a better passer of the basketball. And he's going to have to be if you're going to have a Jalen Wells and Kentavious Caldwell-Pope starting backcourt and 3, in the case of KCP, next to Ja. Because your facilitation definitely takes a hit. That's not the strength of Jalen Wells' game, and it's certainly not the strength of Kentavious Caldwell-Pope's game. So you need to have somebody else that is able to facilitate, and Jaren's going to have the ball in his hands so much that has to be where he's asked to grow. And I think it's okay to ask that question because of the big contract that he just signed. That's a guy that's going to have to step up. And that's a guy that is going to have to be in a position to improve there the most. G.G. Jackson, it may not be fair to ask him to grow that much in that space. And we've talked about that in the comments before. I know folks that are big fans of G.G. think that we're too impressive on him in terms of, we press too hard on him, maybe is the better way to put it, about that creation of offense for others. Maybe that's fair for a player of Gigi's age and experience. But Jaren Jackson Jr. is a near max player in the National Basketball Association. He was just given generational wealth, not for the player that he was, but for the player that he's going to be. So it's going to be on Ja to be available. That's the greatest ability in life, is availability. And it's going to be on Jaren to continue to grow his game. Obviously, I want Ja to be a better three-point shooter. Obviously, I want Ja to be better in the mid-range. I'm sure that that's what he's working on in the lab, as they like to say, the players and cooler kids than me, as we speak. Jaren in the lab needs to work on his passing out of his isolation movements and the work that he does from the three-point line trying to get to the basket. Opposing defenses would collapse on him 2 or 3 men deep. Somebody's open. And this time, in this scenario, it would be one of Jalen Wells, very good three-point shooter, or Kentavious Caldwell-Pope in the past, very good three-point shooter. And no, Ja Morant is not Nikola Jokic, neither is Jaren Jackson Jr. But if you allow KCP to be in a stationary three-point shooting role and you give him open looks, he's going to knock them down. I know he'll knock them down off of Ja Morant passes, and I think that he would if Jaren Jackson Jr. was a better passer. We just haven't seen it consistently enough. But I believe you've invested the money in these guys. They need to be your horses. And then you expect Zach Edey, Jalen Wells, and Kentavious Caldwell-Pope to be elite role players, amplifying through their defense, through their screen setting, their three-point shot making, a combination of it all. You expect them to make Jaren and Ja pop brighter because of their skill sets. Let me know on X, at Joe Mullinax. Hit me up in the comments. Again, Ja Morant, Jalen Wells, Kentavious Caldwell-Pope, Jaren Jackson Jr., Zach Edey. When the team is healthy, I think that's your starting five. In reality, it's probably going to be Santi Aldama and Brandon Clark starting there when the season begins. But who will make up the rest of the rotation? That's what we'll be talking about to close out this episode of Locked On Grizzlies coming up next. Stick around. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to Locked On Grizzlies. I am your host for this episode, Joe Mullinax. So grateful that you've chosen to spend part of your Tuesday with me. Again, DeMichael Cole will be back later this week. Very excited to have him back. Very excited to close out this month of July, hopefully with an episode every day. That's our goal. We'll get into the lighter workload for DeMichael and myself once August hits. Obviously, the dog days of the NBA offseason are coming. Probably not going to be your team every day for the month of August. It'll probably be your team every other day-ish, right? We'll talk more about that as the time gets nearer. But we're here with you. We're here together today. And we've been talking starters, Ja, Jalen, Jaren, KCP, Zach Edey when the team is healthy. That's my starting five. What would my rotation look like after that? I'd have a 10-man rotation. I do think that the team is going to continue to push pace. I think they're going to ask for that effort on the defensive end. And if you're going to ask for pace, if you're going to ask for effort, you probably need to have the capacity to play 10 guys. I don't think 11 is right. And if you're trying to play 11 dudes, I think that you think you're deeper than you are, and you probably need to slow down a smidge. And I do think the Grizzlies will slow down a smidge offensively, but I will go with a 10-man rotation. And again, we're operating under the assumption that everybody is healthy, right? So Edey and Jaren, currently starters, probably won't be there on opening night. That'll be two guys that we'll talk more about here in a moment, Clark and Aldama. What fascinates me about these Memphis Grizzlies as constructed is they have interchangeable rotational pieces on their bench now. And it really shines through in particular in the backcourt and in the front court. Ty Jerome and Scottie Pippen Jr. would be my two reserve guards who play a good amount of basketball. Ty Jerome probably playing a little bit more than Scottie, but I could be talked out of that. Scottie Pippen Jr. showed his wealth as a point of attack defender, showed his value as an offensive shot creator in his play, especially against the Thunder in the playoffs. Ty Jerome, aside from one really bad playoff series, which was really bad, against the eventual Eastern Conference champion Indiana Pacers, aside from that, he had his career year scoring the basketball as a bigger combo guard. Both of them have flaws in their games. You wish they were better creators of offense for others. But the way that they play, the way that they are built in terms of their frames, they are interchangeable in terms of one can play the shooting guard, one can play the point guard. One can defend the bigger guard, one can defend the little perimeter threat, smaller, I should say, perimeter threat. I love how interchangeable their games are between those two. So I'm definitely playing Scottie Pippen Jr., and I'm definitely playing Ty Jerome, right? Ty Jerome didn't sign the contract he signed to not play basketball. In the front court, it's the two guys I mentioned a moment ago that are probably going to be your starters on opening night due to the injuries to Edey and Jackson Jr., Brandon Clark and Santi Aldama. And it's the same idea, right? Santi Aldama is a 6'11", three-level scorer. He can shoot the three, shoot in the mid-range, can get to the basket a little bit. Santi is an offensive weapon. Brandon Clark is the defensive, malleable Swiss Army knife. Brandon Clark is excellent in rotational sets with Jaren Jackson Jr. on the defensive end. He's a 6'7"-ish center. You would think it would be inverted, right? Santi would be the center at 6'11", and Clark at 6'7"-ish, around 6'8", would be the power forward. But that's not how it works on the Grizzlies roster, but that's okay because they are malleable, interchangeable, rotational pieces. And I like any of those four guys next to one of the starters, Jalen Wells, Kentavious Caldwell-Pope. To be honest with you, depending on the lineup, Ja Morant. We talked about the struggles of offensive creation with the starters. Imagine a Ja and Ty Jerome and Scottie Pippen Jr. Three-headed monster. That would be a lot of fun offensively. Defensively, it could get a little nerve-wracking. Definitely would need Clark and Jackson Jr. in that regard. But a lot of offensive firepower possible in that backcourt. So I like those four guys. I like Jerome and Pippen Jr. and I like Clark and Aldama. They are locks for that rotational piece. So now you're at a 9-man rotation. And again, the pace is what makes me say 10. Truth be told, I'd love to roll with those 9 because I'm not sure that we can count on Cedric Coward to be ready in his rookie season to be what Memphis is going to want him to be. I don't know that G.G. Jackson and Vince Williams Jr. and all these other wings that Memphis has, I don't know who's going to be ready. But to be honest with you, that is a positive of this situation. Because what is that going to lead to in training camp? Or at least what should it lead to? Competition. The Grizzlies have 9 dudes, in my opinion, locked in. Morant, Wells, Caldwell Pope, Jackson Jr., Edey. For me, those are your starters. Locked in reserves. Pippen Jr., Jerome, Aldama, and Clark. You're at a 9-man rotation. If you want a 10-man rotation, who's it going to be? Well, pick your flavor of the month. Do you want G.G. Jackson and the versatility he brings? He'd be great. Vince Williams Jr., DeMichael Cole and I are guilty of loving Vince Williams Jr. maybe a little too much. Could Vince Williams Jr., after a full offseason of recovery for his ankle injury, be ready to make that mark? Could it be a Cedric Coward as the 10th man in his rookie season, finding his footing, and hopefully by year 3, he's into bigger and better things for this Grizzlies roster? Could it be somebody we're not expecting? Hopefully it's not John Conchar, but he's technically still on the roster, right? One of those two-way guys getting fully converted. Lots of different ways that this thing can ebb and flow over the next several months going into training camp and, of course, preseason ball. And we have to remember that the team is never going to be fully healthy. I've just come to grips with that, and you probably should too. They won't start the season fully healthy. So there's going to be guys that pop in and out, Von Small, PJ, Hall. There's going to be guys that are in that mix. Hall is probably going to play a good amount. We talked about that on yesterday's show. I would not be surprised. Jock Landale is going to play a ton early in the season. Be ready for it. Because he is a 6'11" big that is going to set screens. I believe that the Grizzlies have 9 locked-in rotation guys, and the competition for that 10th spot is going to go down the training camp. Vince Williams Jr., G.G. Jackson, Cedric Coward. They're the ones that make the most sense. Cam Spencer's going to be part of that conversation. But I would go a 10-man rotation because of the speed they want to play with and the defensive effort that they want to bring to the court. 9-man, that's what you do in the playoffs, hopefully. And if we're talking about the playoffs in Memphis and they're actually competing, it was a better season than last year. So that's my early takeaway on the starters and the reserves. Let me know in the comments. Hit me up on X at Joe Mullinax. How are you feeling about the starters and reserves going into next season? Again, super early here in July. That was a great YouTube comment. Thanks so much for suggesting a really good thought process. Helped me kind of map out my expectations for the season moving forward. So thank you so much to everybody that comments over on YouTube and hits us up on social media. And thank you so much for being with me on this edition of Locked On Grizzlies. Again, to Michael Cole, hopefully we'll be back on the Wednesday show. He may not be. Again, I want to stress that. It'll be a nice surprise if he is. If he's not, we have plenty that we can talk about. We can take a look at different ways to maybe replace Edey and Jackson Jr. with their injuries. I mentioned Aldama and Clark being the most likely option. But we can go off the grid a little bit. I've talked about G.G. Jackson as a 5 before. There's lots of different angles that we can take as we go into tomorrow's show and kind of work off of this premise. We talked about the rotation when it's healthy. Now what should we expect going into training camp with Edey and Jackson Jr. on the mend? I feel like that's a good topic for tomorrow's show. Thank you for making Locked On Grizzlies your first listen today. For your second listen, find the Locked On NBA podcast where there is no offseason. Doug, Matt, and Hayes keep you up to date on contract negotiations, rumors, and everything that you need to be the most informed NBA fan. Find Locked On NBA on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you so much for being with me on this episode of Locked On Grizzlies. Make sure you're checking us out on YouTube, Spotify, Amazon, YouTube, Amazon, Google, Spotify. Anywhere you get a podcast, you can find Locked On Grizzlies. Make us a part of your NBA and Memphis Grizzlies content consumption each and every time that an episode drops. Become an everydayer if you're not already one. Hopefully, I will see you here tomorrow. Stay locked in. Enjoy the rest of your Tuesday. And make sure you're here with us on our Wednesday edition of Locked On Grizzlies. See you.